so I have set aside some time for that, and I would welcome any that you have. Yes?
At what age do you think it's really appropriate to start teaching children formally to read?
To teach, at what age do I think it's appropriate to start teaching children
To formally read.
to formally read?
Not all the readiness.
Well, how I wish that one could accept an answer these days that says it varies from child to child. Yeah? Oh, well, oh, really? Oh, my goodness, nobody ever thought of that. I am a therapist, and I really don't believe in letting them swing from trees and hear stories until they're 8 or 9 without getting in there and wondering a little bit about what might be going on in the language system. But there are several questions I want to know about a child before I would make that decision. And I would want to know, first of all, how is expressive language? Because that's the first place that problem's going to show up. You all know that reading disorders are not primarily visual disorders. They're primarily a disorder of the language processing system somewhere. Although it may extend over into various kinds of sequencing tasks or tasks that require fast temporal processing of any kind of stimulus, which means things that come at you quickly. So that's the first thing I want to check. If they have good articulation, because again, that's your tip of your iceberg, where you start to see these artic problems that are different from normal lisping or whatever you would expect a child to do at a preschool age. Then you start to get in there and say, are they hearing the sounds? I know you know a lot about phonological awareness, right? Isn't that part of your program? And I think you teach it too. It's very important. I want to be doing that, and I want to be working with rhymes. As far as when I start to introduce formal exercises in sound symbol correspondence, it's really hard to say. With kindergartners, I'm inclined to do a lot of language experience. That's the old-fashioned, and I don't know if that's part of your program or not, but that's the old-fashioned. They dictate, you write it down as they dictate it, and there's a variety of opinions as to how much you correct their grammar. But you write it in correct orthography. I also, and again, this probably is not part of your program, will use invented or temporary spelling with some children. But if a child has a real serious phonological deficit, I'm really worried about using that embedded spelling either at all or for too long, because they're imprinting incorrect formulations. But for a child with good normal language development, that seems to work usually pretty well. But again, I want to make the transition. See, I guess what I'm saying is I teach reading. I don't let an administrator or a politician teach my children to read. I am the teacher, and I make the decisions, which is probably why I'm not working in some of the public schools these days. But when I was in a classroom, you know, those are decisions that I was at liberty to make. And unfortunately, many teachers are not at liberty to make those decisions. But, you know, frankly, to me, the received wisdom should be that first grade is still the right time to be teaching children to read formally. But in kindergarten, I mean, I would be doing language experience. I would be bombarding them with words and poems and rhymes and experiences in some kind of writing, whether we want them to be using embedded spelling or temporary spelling is a choice that each, you know, curriculum will have to make for itself, but I just want them to be just embedded in the written word. But first grade is a good time, but with some first graders, you really have to go easy. You know this. There are some 6-year-olds who simply can't link that sound and that symbol. And it may be because there's simply the area on their left hemisphere called the angular gyrus, Brodmann's area 39, is simply not sufficiently matured or stimulated by previous experience to make use of what it is you're trying to give to them. But I understand that in a lot of the schools that you work with, there are intensive programs that are very formal for very young children. And I mean, if you want more business, they're creating learning disabilities for you. But the thing is, along with those, they're giving you these emotional problems, all that negative neural connection that comes with it. And the child sees the book, and immediately you get a rush of neurotransmitters that says, don't go near that because you're going to fail and be humiliated. And maybe worse. It makes it very hard for us later on to take these kids and reestablish that. So I don't know what the answer to this is, because all the early childhood people are almost uniformly yelling and screaming about this overly early introduction of formal academics, and yet nothing seems to be getting worse. And I honestly do not know what the answer is going to be here. If you can just persuade your school to listen to the early childhood people they have, and listen to NAEYC, the organization that gives them a lot of information. It's a very difficult problem, and I sympathize with you in trying to work with that. Yes.
Many of our students have very awkward, tight, and even sometimes I've seen painful pencil from the writing that they've had. Anything in the book, that's right. But, 4 fingers on top of the pencil is so much neat. And I know that you probably don't have an answer to what to do or what caused it.
Yeah.
But what kind of insight can you give us about that?
Yes, I do have an answer about what caused it. And by the way, I was appalled to see that my granddaughter has it, the claw. Here's what happens. The brain myelinates from top to bottom and inside out. The nervous system, I should say, myelinates from top to bottom and inside out, proximodistal and cephalocaudal. Back to, first year biology or something, which means that the fingers are among the last things to be mature in terms of effective use in the nervous system, particularly the fine integration of those muscles. There's another theory proposed by a woman named Benbow up at Boston University quite a number of years ago, in which she says that because children are being carried in these infant seats, and they're always being carried. They're not down on the floor crawling and climbing upstairs and using this muscle right in here, which is integral. So we're talking about both nervous system development and muscular development of the hand. Okay, so what happens? Every parent wants their 3-year-old to be holding a pencil, right? And I mean, they all have them. You cannot keep children these days from having pencils and crayons when they're 3 years old, because they see the adults, they want to do it. And how do they hold it? Well, they're not myelinated out to here, and they don't have the muscular development, so how do they hold it? They hold it like this, and they write, and everybody thinks that's so cute. What we should be having them do is to write on an easel or a chalkboard or in the air or, whatever, using more of the gross system. And when you're writing up like this, you almost have to hold the pencil correctly. So anyway, but we're not. We're having them on, here's the golf swing that's maladaptive embedded in the brain. They get to you, they're 7, and they've got this claw. All right, I've tried grippies, I've tried everything. I mean, there's some point, with my granddaughter, I'm thinking, who I don't see all that often, what am I going to do? Can you imagine this situation? What am I going to do? First of all, it's my daughter-in-law, not my daughter, so I can't honestly say very much. So, you know what? I said to myself, so what? She'll use a word processor. But you know what? At some point, I honestly did, with these 7 and 8-year-olds, I began to say, what is my time worth and what is my relationship worth with this child? The grippies help. You use them probably, or the pencils now have them built in. I mean, and you know, yelling and harping at them will probably do it, but I have rarely, to be honest with you, managed to change that pencil grip. And now I haven't given you very good news yet so far, have I? But there are some things that are worth really beating yourself and the child up about, and there are some things that aren't, and I finally decided with some children maybe that this was one of these things. And it's not a good solution, and unless we can change early childhood programs and stop them from trying to get these kids to write with these little cramped things, I don't think we can repair all the damage in the world, and there's lots worse damage that we're having to repair these days. Yes.
Are we crippling our brain repair and change by giving kids, ADHD kids, ADD kids, depressed kids, chemicals?
Well, you see, I have real mixed feelings about chemicals. I'm aware that sometimes they really do help the child move toward normalcy to a point where you can start working with them. Now, here's the deal, though. If you give them one of the psychoactive drugs, and these are powerful drugs whose long-term effects we do not know, sorry, they'll tell you they do, but we don't have long-term data on this, that they should be given under a doctor's supervision. The doctor must see the child at least every 6 months and be in communication with both parent and teacher. And there must be behavioral therapy for both parents and child along with the drugs. This is not happening, because all the drug does is open the doorway temporarily, for as long as it lasts, which it may be a day and a half, it opens that doorway for that child to receive information and process it perhaps in a different way, so that we can work with them on their behavior and getting their own controls. And what I want to try to show you in this session as we move into the slides is how the language centers and the prefrontal cortex, this is Luria, some of whom is in your packets of study somewhere along the way, can actually take control over some of these lower systems that have to do with attention through the use of language and mediating language. Talking through the problem, what am I going to, this is put down your pencil, or sit on your pencil, or put your pencil on the floor, and now tell me, what is your task here? It's a worksheet. It was sent over from the teacher. Some worksheets are good. All right, this is a good worksheet. We're going to do this worksheet. It's going to be useful for us. But I want you to look at it, and without doing a thing with that pencil, I want you to use words to tell me what this is. This is a matching. I used to have children invent directions for worksheets. I'd take the directions off, and they had to make up the directions and learn to give them to their, their partner or the rest of the group. And then we would look at what the dumb person who wrote the book had made as their directions, and sometimes ours were better than theirs. They wanted us to draw a line, just a plain old boring straight line from the word to the picture, and we're going to make squiggly marks from the word to the picture, or whatever. But it puts them in control of the task. It gives them a feeling of accountability. It's their task. They have ownership over this. Plus, it makes them look over this thing and say, well, how would I tell somebody to do this? Because they're used to just looking at it and starting to make marks and connect things, and half the time it doesn't make any difference. But I always have them use language first to tell me, and they have to do it in sentence form. There are 5 pictures on this page. There are 5 words. Our job is to draw a line from the picture to the word that matches it. Full sentences. So you're working on language training, you're working on perceptual organization, you're working on sequencing, and you're working on getting control of a task. And then the child with the ADD is allowed to say when the others are going to pick up their pencil and start to work. You know, again, control. And you'll hear in all your ADD seminars that this is partially a disorder of motivation. They have to have immediate reinforcement. They can't wait for their rewards. And if you're giving them this, you know, they're getting the immediate reinforcement because they're doing something and they're getting recognition for. So, you know, all that by way of, what was the question? Oh, about meds. There are a lot of other ways to handle this than just meds. Now, you know, as I say, with some kids it appears that meds really do help open that door. I am appalled at what we're giving children. I have worked over the years with a neurological pediatrician who used to be very much an advocate of medicating children for particularly ADD, but other things as well. And the last time I spoke to him was several years back, but he said he is appalled at what he calls the drug cocktails that are coming into his office. He says these children are coming in and they are on a tricyclic antidepressant, they are on attention deficits, they are on things that, he said, sometimes I haven't even heard of them. He said, I have a way of doing this. He says, I keep a PDD, a physician's desk reference in the John. He says, I say to the mother, oh, excuse me a moment, please. I'll be back. He runs out of the room. He looks up the names of these weird new medications this kid is on and comes back. And then he can talk to her about this drug cocktail that her child is on. But I know one child who several of us sent for an evaluation, and to my horror, the evaluation came back with him ending up taking a whole bunch of meds, one of which was an antidepressant. And he was a disaster. He was just a disaster. And he was up and down on the meds, and it wasn't helping anything. He still couldn't read, and oh, ye gods. And they took him off all the meds, and they got him to a really good behavioral psychologist. And this guy worked with the parents on establishing limits and behavioral reinforcement contingencies, and worked with the child on taking control of his own life. At that point, he was 8 years old. And you would not know that this child is the same child. It's just, he still can't read, but he is a totally different child. Yes, way in the back.
We have a slide of the boys who were playing with the Game Boy video game.
Yes.
Besides the social isolation, can you comment on brain hemisphere dominance with that?
You know, I wish I could comment on brain hemispheric dominance with things like Game Boys. We really don't know, but you certainly don't have to be a genius to work out that they're not using much of their language centers, right? On the left side, and that's of great concern to me. So you're basically getting something lopsided. The areas that they're using, we really don't know because it hasn't been, I haven't seen any studies on that. And we could use some of that imaging. It would be interesting to see. The thing I think that is of even more concern to me is in this frontal, and as we look at the pictures, this is all going to start to come together, I think, in a more definite picture for you. But when we start to wonder how these executive circuits are getting any kind of stimulation out of this, and that means your ability to plan, to monitor your own behavior, to think ahead, to relate socially to other people, to have a moral view of what you're doing, to be able to, as it were, look down on yourself and say, this is me in a culture, this is me among other people. How do I want to be? Who am I? And how do I want to appear? And I'm thinking that all they're doing is they're responding immediately to the input on here, and I have to believe that that whole area is being shortchanged in favor of very expedient reward systems which are built into those games. It's you win, you push a button as fast as you can, you may have to guess, and if you get it right, you do it again the next time and you do it faster, and your point is to win. And you might be interested in knowing, I don't know if you people associate with nice people, and you may not hear about things like this. I read the New York Times, so I don't always associate with the nicest people. But an article in the Times, I happen to like the New York Times, but anyway, a week ago Sunday talked about a new video game, and this is written again by a techie. This is their tech reporter. Have any of you heard of Grand Theft Auto 3? This is, several people have. This is the subject of considerable discussion, and for good reason. This is a video game which is supposed to be only marketed for adults, but you know very well who's getting it, and some parents are letting their teenage boys play this or buying it for them. This is the most popular game now that teenage boys are asking for. The purpose of the players take on the roles of ex-cons roaming a city. They steal cars. That's the first thing. They have to steal cars, carrying out depraved missions for the mob, killing cops, picking up prostitutes, beating pedestrians senseless with a bat. In short, affecting the worst kind of urban mayhem short of inflating stock prices. Well, it has been among the hottest sellers in the country since its release in October, banned for sale in Australia. You get out of the car and bash heads, explained one player. It doesn't have a moral, you just bash. But the ancillary issue here is that if you need to be recharged, you may pick up a prostitute and do whatever with the prostitute, which recharges you, and then you let the prostitute out of the car, and then you can go back, kill the prostitute, you beat her, and you get there's a feedback mechanism in the joystick that enables you to feel yourself, and you see the blood, and then you can take your money back off the prostitute and leave. Excuse me. I mean, that's a long way from these little boys in the schoolyard playing Game Boy, but this is what is happening this is what our children are some of them are being exposed to. I don't know. Well, anyway, never mind. So what's this doing to prefrontal cortex? I mean, hardened criminals, we have scans of their prefrontal cortices that show that they're simply not firing much up there. Are we building this into people's brains? Yeah, hello. Excuse me, I'm so exercised about this I can hardly even call on someone, yes. Well, another question.
I'd like for you to comment on the new IM instant messenger with teenagers using like LOL for laugh out loud.
Yeah.
They are using language because they're writing back and forth and talking,
Mm-hmm.
yet they're not using whole language.
No, they certainly aren't. And I find myself on the internet not capitalizing, and if I miss the shift key, it's like, oh well, just go on. The question has to do with instant messaging, and we know that the girls are actually using that. That's the only thing so far about computers that has really taken up the girls' interest. In general, you know, many girls enjoy video games or whatever, or good stuff on the computer, but the girls go home, and instead of getting together with their friends or having a phone conversation as people used to, they're on the internet, and they're dissing each other too. Interestingly enough, they're spreading catty rumors and doing this and that, but the girls have always done that. But in terms of, from our point of view as therapists, all the abbreviations that are being used, I don't know. It's a trade-off, as you point out, because they are using a lot of written language. But it's very sketchy. And I don't know what that means. I just know that it is part of the culture. The interesting thing is, you see, I see this as an aspect of what I call in endangered minds and what the researchers call code switching. And I know several codes. I can speak to teenagers in something that approximates something that they've heard before, although it gets outdated so fast that it's hard to keep up with them. I mean, I can speak to academic audiences. I can speak to audiences of parents who haven't been to college. And I can also communicate that way on the internet, quickly and almost non-verbally. Because I've learned all these codes. My concern, it's like with black students, they tell us that they like to speak black dialect with each other at lunch when they're sitting together at the lunch table. But when the teacher from another linguistic group comes up behind the table, they code switch and they start to speak in the language of academia. And then the teacher leaves and they code switch back again. And to me that shows a rather fluid brain that is pretty good at moving from one type of language to another. My concern is that these children are learning only the codes of the street and the instant messaging, and they're not learning the codes of academia. So when we put them into Mark Twain, when they're in the 5th grade or 6th grade, they've never heard language like this before. They don't have this code. It means nothing to them. The word however, moreover, this is why I used to teach so much language training with middle schoolers, because they have to learn all of the connectives. They have to learn all the adverbs, please note, that start an introductory subordinate clause, and you know, that sort of thing that they just don't have it, and we have to get that into their brain. And that's why I think instead of trying to bang reading into the heads of 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds, we should be reading them quite elevated selections of prose and poetry to get those codes into those brains when they're so formative and flexible. Okay, we're going to I allowed about 45 minutes for questions. I hope that's all right with you. That makes the presentation down to 45 minutes. Is anybody going to object to that? Okay. Yes.
If you have a student that's markedly deficient in a lot of areas, then you want to increase the therapy time that you spend with them. As far as brain stimulation, would it be better to make it longer in one session to get more areas in that session, or is it better to do it more times a week?
Boy, that is a really good question. The question is, if you have limited time, which we all do, and it's so frustrating with a student, whether you do it, you try to schedule it in one longer block, maybe once a week or twice a week, 2 times a week, or in 5 shorter blocks. And how long are the blocks you're referring to?
The blocks that we typically do are hour and 20 minutes twice a week, but in that time she's so slow at processing, we do not get all the areas, and she's ready to do more. She's like, oh, I could keep going. So do I keep going, and make it longer, and maybe make her, 2.5 hours or whatever, or am I better to do an hour and 20 minutes 4 days a week? Because she's so.
Well, I don't know about the brain. I can't pull any brain research out of my mental bank that relates to this. But there's a lot of research in learning theory on this. And spaced practice and reinforcement is important. The thing that I'm also aware of, though, it takes you lose some time when you're setting up and leaving. And I mean, I used to have something, I'm sure you do, ready for them to start the minute they got in there, and they know that they're going to start that, and it's something fast and quick that gets them functioning quickly. But I think again it might be different with different children. It sounds like you have an option, and maybe this child could really.
She's slow at starting.
Yeah.
When she gets going, she's a lot faster.
Well.
So each session you're slow at getting going. So
Yeah. Then I think I'd be inclined to try to stretch it out. how nice if you do have the option of maybe developing a schedule that seems to work for each child. Some children couldn't be with you for over 2 hours. You'd lose them. I mean, you'd have to plan so carefully that you probably do better in shorter spaced periods. It depends a little. You're doing process training, right? You're not just remediating the worksheets that come from the classroom. Okay. Yeah, I'd be inclined to if she can take the time and it's proving effective, I'd be inclined to take it. But again, I'm not an oracle on that, and I don't know I can't cite any brain research that would support or disconfirm that. Yes, in the back, how about in the back there? We've been neglecting you guys in the back. Anybody back there? No? All right, everybody's happy back there. I should have my glasses on. Yes, here's one back here. Anencephaly, no, I don't know, and that honestly is sort of out of my field. That's the brain that really isn't there when the child is born, and I mean, they might have the lower, correct me if I'm wrong here, they might have the brain stem that keeps them functioning just barely, and that's it. I think, maternal viruses have been implicated in that, but I don't know anything more about that. I'm sorry. I imagine there's information on the internet about that. People say to me, you recommend the internet? Of course I recommend the internet. We have adult brains. Our brains are formed. The internet is invaluable. How would you get some information without it? How would I know where planes fly without Travelocity? But the point is, we already have reading, language, writing, and listening skills. We're not recommending it necessarily for people who are under 7 years old, or maybe even older than that. Yes?
Do you have a recommended age when kids should start using computers?
In failure to connect, I suggest age 7 as a minimum. I've been criticized for this from both camps. Many people say, 7? They will never join the modern generation if they don't start till 7. I'm like, wait a minute, I started at 57, stupid. I mean, I taught myself PowerPoint when I was 66, for crying out loud. And it's like the brain does keep growing for a lifetime, and you can make new connections as long as you are healthy. Dear God, let's hope we are, and keep working at it. But there was a critical period when I couldn't have developed my language if I hadn't used it. There is no critical period for computer use. Other people, now the Waldorf people have faulted me. They think 7's too young. They don't want to see it in elementary schools at all. I think if I were a 3rd grade teacher, I might want a couple computers in my class. I think there's some very interesting things I could do with conceptually oriented science units on the internet. And there are ways to represent things there. And in middle school, we do have some research, and there's very little good research in this whole area. I tried to pull it all into the book, and I had trouble finding it. But I talk about a couple of applications in middle school, and that where children are really moving into, David Perkins has called it ramps to the abstract. Do you work with any older children on math and science and that kind of thing? How much trouble, especially our learning disabled ones, have with abstract concepts such as proportion and velocity. And it's been shown in studies that good simulations on the computer can help them understand. It moves them into more abstract kinds of thinking, which is so incredibly important at that age. That's what their brain's task is, and it may be able to give a little extra scaffolding that we can't provide. So I think there are interesting things that can be done at any age, but I would put 7 pretty much as a minimum. I know that I really object to preschoolers because I think the material that's on it is awful, and I think they have so many better things they should be doing with their time. Yes?
If you learned correctly in your late 60s, how old are you?
How old am I? I'm 67, and my husband is only 66, and he's going to be 67 in one more week. I feel like I've been around for centuries, yes. No, not really, not really. That was last year. I taught myself PowerPoint. Okay. Other questions? Here's one right here.
I have a question about autistic.
Autism, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the autistic brain?
Well, we don't know. You know, there's very little agreement about the autistic brain, but boy, we are surely finding some interesting stuff. And the one thing that has been implicated over and over again is the cerebellum, which is interesting because the cerebellum, way back down here, do any of you work with sensory integration therapists? They are very big on the whole idea of coordinating body around the midline and balance and all that kind of thing. And some of them are pretty good. I think it is. It's an interesting adjunct to other kinds of therapy. But they have been saying for a long, long time, and their guru is a woman called Jean Ayers. And she said, and many others said, that the whole system from the cerebellum back here, which has to do with your balance, we can test your cerebellum right now. If you close your eyes, hold out your right index finger, now touch your nose with your eyes closed. If you manage to do that, you've got a functioning cerebellum. Does that make you feel good? If anybody couldn't, please don't see me at the end of this workshop. But for years, everyone said, oh, cerebellum, schmerebellum, you know, it's myelinated when you're born, big deal, so you keeps your balance. Well, turns out that this, and it's big, way back down here, that it is not a wasteland, as has been believed for so long, and it continues to myelinate and mature all the way up into adolescence. And that appears to have a lot to do with higher language functioning, conceptual formation, a whole bunch of other stuff. And yet it's all tied in with your system of balance and movement, maybe rhythm, who knows. And this is part of what often shows up in autistic brains, but many other things as well. And again, we're talking about structure in terms of function. Who knows what chemical issues there are in autistic brains? Because, you know, some people think certain diets were, you know, there's no question it's somewhat hereditary. But the thing that is interesting me right now is a variant, and it may be a variant of autism, and it may be a separate thing called Asperger's. And yesterday, Dr. Feuerstein and I were talking after he mentioned that these things are being vastly overdiagnosed right now and overgeneralized. And Asperger's now is the diagnosis du jour, if you haven't noticed. Asperger's is a very rare condition, and I suspect that a lot of the ones we're hearing called Asperger's really are something else or nothing. I mean, not nothing, but just a variant within the normal range. But there is some talk in the literature about the fact that Asperger's is becoming more prevalent for a couple of reasons, and that is a lot of computer nerds are in fact borderline Asperger's, which might put them, depending on how you define Asperger's, which people are still arguing about, it might put them on the high end of the autistic spectrum or just somewhere in the PDD spectrum that is different. And that they are, for the first time in history, intermarrying. Now, these people have serious social problems. If you have never had an Asperger's kid, you really cannot understand the difficulty they have in understanding other people's social communication, such as gesture, facial expression, just putting them, they don't have what some people call a theory of mind. They seem to have trouble getting inside anybody else's mind. I mean, They're there and they're very concrete and very literal and sometimes very gifted. But anyway, these kinds of people seem to tend to be drawn to computer programming. Well, now for the first time in Silicon Valley, where this has been noticed, and Bellingham, Washington, we have both males and females working in the same environment with this same interest in not being with other people and being with computers, and invariably nature takes over and they end up marrying each other. And so for the first time in history, you have a gene pool developing with this recessive, what must be a recessive, becoming more dominant, and these huge concentrations of Asperger's kids in those particular areas. Now that's an interesting idea, isn't it? That was just one study, so I wouldn't bet the farm on it. But you see, my contention is that if a child has any problems with social emotional development in those areas, they are A, drawn to the computer very early, frequently have parents who love the computer and who don't see anything wrong with not associating with other people socially, and encourage their children to act like a genius on the computer. So you get a 5-year-old who might have looked reasonably normal to you, and now he is his full-out Asperger's because he's never related to another human being in his life, and all he wants to do is sit there compulsively hitting on computer keys. Do you have any like that? And they tantrum if you make them leave. So this is all very interesting to me, but that's sort of another thing. But if you see these sort of herky-jerky, weird kids that can't relate to other people, you're looking at something on that continuum. But that, as I agree with Feuerstein, it doesn't mean we have to give them a label. It just means we have to work with them. Okay. And we've got one more pressing question here, and then we're going to move on. Yes?
I'm curious, is there any hope for a child that has a deficiency in the cerebellum?
Well, I don't know if there's any hope for a child with deficiency. If you suspect that, I would hie them off to a sensory integration therapist. I mean, I wouldn't even sit until the end of this session. I would run right out that door right now and get a sensory integration therapist on the phone. The earlier, the better. And I have, I came up through the language therapy and pretty much the same kind of belief systems that you guys have around what works in therapy. But I have referred kids to sensory integration therapists and had really good results if I had a good therapist. So it's something to think about. Okay, I'd like to move to what you really did come to hear about today, which is, if I can now get this to start. Okay, here we go. Come on. Screen. Unblack screen. Okay. All right. Gee, well, I'll tell you, this is pretty cool. I yet have a lot to learn about PowerPoint. If I'd ever spend much time on it, I could learn to do a lot of really, really other excellent things that I haven't yet learned, but this is sufficient. I'm so sort of, thank you. She's moving my briefcase. It is sort of like having a dead body back here that I keep tripping over. I am so concerned about what is happening to children in our culture that I just wanted to talk about this just a little bit, and then I want to hear from you what you're seeing, and I think it'd be helpful maybe for you folks to talk a little bit among yourselves about what you actually are seeing in terms of what's happening to children and maybe what we can help to do about it. Okay. This is what I see coming out as a function of our disrespect for the processes of childhood in the culture. And some of them have to do with that early academic training that we talked about, overly early forcing, and others with just pure and simple neglect of what children need. We've got, I'm going to stand over here, I guess. I don't want to be in front of your screen. Could someone push that, just re-angle that so that it's a little bit to the left on the big screen up there. There you go, thanks. So get it away from me. Yeah, this is perfect. Okay. So what do we have? We have an increase in incidence of dyslexia, and of course, a dyslexic may or may not even show up, if it's a mild case, if they have really good language training early on, and really good language experiences, and a nice structured approach to hearing the sounds of language and sequencing them. You might not ever even notice that they were dyslexic, and they might get along just fine. But now I think we're seeing an exacerbation because children simply don't get that phonological awareness training from Sesame Street. I'm sorry. Dancing, visuals do not improve your auditory system. All right, developmental language disorders, likewise. We see more sensory integration dysfunction as a function of children not using their bodies, not playing creatively with their bodies. I have had many physical therapists tell me they have 8- and 9-year-old children coming to them now with the motor skills of 3- and 4-year-olds, which is alarming because it is more and more being recognized that the motor system and the development of the motor system contributes very profoundly to cognitive development. And we're only once again really beginning to look at how this may affect our incidence of various kinds of learning disorders. We're seeing more of these nonverbal learning disorders. The social emotional learning disorders are sometimes called, which also might include the Asperger's, might include the kids who are really socially clumsy. The frontal lobe syndromes are thought to be the ones of lack of control, conduct disorders, attention deficit disorder, impulsivity. We all know about those kids. And pervasive developmental disorders, which I've again put Asperger's because we're not quite sure where it fits, and the autistic spectrum. And it is my sense that all of these conditions, and again, I don't like putting labels on children, but all of these types of syndromes that we're seeing could be exacerbated by a lack of an appropriate early childhood or childhood environment. Okay, now this is what I want you to get involved in. This is a fill in the blank, except the more divergent the answer is here, or the more irreverent, the more credit you're going to get. If you come up with the right answer, you'll be excluded from school in humiliation, okay? There is no right answer. Teaching students today is like blank because blank. A lot of you have been in teaching for several years. Is it changing any? Are the students today different than they used to be? Just write the first thing that comes to your mind, and if it is a little irreverent, that's all right. And I'm going to ask you to share this with somebody who's sitting near you. This needs to be off the top of your head. Okay, now just turn to, if you could just sort of cluster in groups of 4, maybe, and exchange what you wrote, and explain a little bit what you mean. What is the experience like for you today? which is quite an amazing technique. We train the children. I raise my hand. That means your mouth closes. You raise your hand. And then everybody, let's practice it. You start talking again. Come on, talk. I had primed you so that worked even better than usual, but it does work, and the kids like it. It gives them a feeling there is some structure. There is someone. Don't you think children like to think that someone is in charge? I mean, they push us, but they want, I tell parents, the reason they're pushing is they want limits. Then they'll push you until you get them. They get them, and look out. You may find yourself someplace you don't want to be pushed to if you don't stop here. Okay, let's hear some good ones here. Who either wants to volunteer or nominate someone from your group? Teaching students today is like what, because what? All right, stand up, please, if you don't mind.
Teaching students today is like aligning opposite magnets because they lack a sense of locus of control.
Oh, I want to be able to say that again so I can get it and repeat it so everyone can hear the whole thing.
Teaching students today is like trying to align opposing magnets because they lack a locus of control.
Oh, it's like trying to align opposing magnets, if you think of yourself trying to do that, because they lack a locus of control. Ah. Or is it because their locus of control is external, not internal? That's fabulous, my gosh. All right, more. They'll be different. Now, you're not allowed to have one that's like that. You have to have one that's different. That's a hard act to follow, yes. All right, here we have a volunteer. Would you mind standing up?
I said it's like talking to a wall because they act like they don't respond or hear you.
It's like talking to a wall because they act as if they don't respond or hear you. And if you figure that ever since they were born, they've literally been having to screen out excessive auditory stimulation. They have literally learned not to listen. And in order to watch the TV, they've had to learn to ignore language and not listen to language. And we're trying to train them in opposite directions. Do you have good ways of teaching kids to listen? I think a lot of children today, actually, you need to start way back with when you listen to someone, you look at them, and something's supposed to be happening in your mind. I mean, I think a lot of them don't actually know that, and so that when they're through talking, you can say what they said, maybe not in the same words, but you can say the same thing, sort of, and I just say there are a lot, I think, more listening games. If you can invent some great listening games, you'll really be doing a service to your kids, and you can publish a book. I mean, everyone's looking for good ways to teach kids to listen. Other ones, let's hear some more, yes.
Teaching today is like having to use cheerleader pom-poms because children want sis, boom, bah.
It's like having to use cheerleader pom-poms because children want sis, boom, bah. And some of you may have said having to put on a Sesame Street presentation because they can't pay attention otherwise. I hear that a lot from teachers everywhere, and not just in this country anymore, too, interestingly enough. Pop culture is having its effects widely. What's the answer to that? You're going to put on more of a show? They want to be entertained. An English teacher, I don't know how I ended up talking to her on the phone when I was writing Failure to Connect. I think maybe I was talking to her about the way she used, it's really hard to use computers well in an English class. There's just not a whole lot of reason, except if you're doing research, to use computers in an English class. I think I was talking to her about something she had managed to do, and she said, by the way, did you know I'm retiring at the end of this year? I said, retiring? I have never met you, but by your voice you sound like you're about 40. She said, I am. But she said, and I was named Teacher of the Year last year. And I said, well, why in the world are you retiring? She says, I am exhausted. She said, last year, in order to keep my class attending, I feigned a heart attack, danced on my desk, wore my clothes upside down. She said, I am exhausted. I have no more acts. I cannot do this anymore. And you know, the point being, we can't keep entertaining them more and more. It's impossible. I was at Epcot yesterday, as you know, and I promise you, there's no way that I am more entertaining than what is there. And, I mean, I cannot shrink the audience in 3D. I simply can't do it. So what is the answer to this? I mean, this is going to make teaching impossible unless we adopt a different paradigm. What different paradigm might work here?
I think we're back to the initial question. We need to do the right thing earlier. You know,
Okay.
the things that, you know, the New Yorker cover that you had up there.
Yeah, yeah.
Go back to activities that are appropriate earlier so that children learn how to entertain themselves, how to be stimulated physically to do things, not be depressed, and be able to function when it's appropriate.
Or at least we can't take that out of their homes. They've got it. But maybe in a school setting, yes. Okay.
I think, at least in our case, at our house, it would be a result of my decreasing the amount of activity I'm involved in so I can help them attend.
Yeah, the adults, getting the adults more involved in their lives. And that's certainly something that you need to encourage your parents to do. Up to being a little bossy. And up to being a little bossy, you know, you have here a child who we've discussed, you know, we have some concerns about Joe. Joe's coming along wonderfully, and he's so bright. We want to see him exercise that brightness. And we want to see Joe happy in his class and feeling good about his learning. But in order to do that, Joe is going to have to stop watching so much television, period. I mean, haven't they hired you? Are they paying you, or the school's paying you? In some cases, whoever is, you're the professional, and you need to tell them, don't hold back. Say, you know, this is, and give them an amount. If Joe's watching 3 hours a night, bring it down to 1. And they may need to negotiate that with Joe. But, I mean, I think that we have a role. I mean, when I was an administrator in a lower school a long time ago, we had a parent meeting and said, you are going to stop showing these scary movies to our elementary school girls when they're over at sleepovers, period. We do not want inappropriate films shown at sleepovers. And this wasn't even a Christian school, for crying out loud, and we got away with it. I mean, we're the boss, you know, we are the experts, and they're paying their money to us to educate their children. They need to pay attention. Okay, yes, I absolutely agree with all that. I wonder just in a classroom or a therapy situation, though, is it not true that if the child is involved in pursuing competency or pursuing a question that's interesting or trying to reach a goal of some kind, that you don't need to put on a show, because the show is coming from the kid? And that's that internal locus of control. But I think we are doomed if we are simply trying to do it to them. I think we've got to get them involved in the process of reaching for that learning or skill or whatever that is. Yes, a hand back there.
I was just thinking about the emotional intelligence theory, and if we're using those in the classroom, then the kids should be putting on the show, right?
Absolutely, the kids should be putting on the show. And I must say that is one thing. And you remember the first picture I started with this morning of the old school with the boys bored out of their tree? That's the one thing the computer has convinced some teachers of. Some teachers don't understand that the learning has to be in the child, not in them. And if they get the child involved in more project-oriented learning in the classroom, rather than just drill and kill, as we call it, that the child's brain is going to take over the excitement of making it happen. And the show then is in saying, hey, I got better at this. That's what they want more than anything else. You watch a 7-year-old walk down the curb, a narrow curb, and that kid will walk down the curb until they can do it right. Well, then what happens? They can do it right, then it's boring. What do they want to do next? They should now learn to walk backwards down the curb, so they'll practice walking backward. Why? Because they want to be competent. That's their main drive at that age. Erickson told us that a long time ago. So they learn to walk backwards down the curb. No one is applauding. It's simply for their own personal satisfaction. So then what do? Well, then they have to learn to hop down the curb on one foot, whatever. You watch children and you will notice that they are constantly challenging themselves for a higher and a higher level of performance or excellence of some kind. Okay, let me run through, I just have a few pictures here. Some of them just happen to be of my grandchildren, but they're going to give you a brief tour of what childhood looks like when it isn't subverted by electronic screens and what have you, and talk a little bit about the zone of proximal development. And then I'd like to, finally, before we adjourn today, I'd like to just review for you the idea that the cortex does develop in layers, and that we're talking about both concrete and symbolic development here, as well as abstract, and how that may relate also to the attention system. And then finally, just for a small task at the end, I'm going to try to show you where I think the self is located in the brain and how all of that sets itself up and works. So with that task in mind, we're going to now see some pictures of the zone of proximal development in action. This is Andrew, age, what, about 18 months here? When Andrew was about a year old, maybe 9, 10 months old, he had a set of those nesting blocks, the big ones with the storybook pictures on them. And I was playing with Andrew one day in his bedroom where he has a lot of toys strung along. And we were working on maybe stacking the blocks. Well, it soon became evident, even to my stupid and over-pushing disposition that on that day, that Andrew was no way going to be able to stack those blocks. So I thought, well, maybe we can use these blocks. So Andrew was throwing the blocks around the room. That was fun. Thought maybe Andrew can learn to nest the blocks. So that soon became evident that Andrew, at that age, in no way was going to be able to nest these blocks. I mean, it involves seriation, for heaven's sake, and they don't get that until much later. So I finally thought, well, I'll take the biggest block and the littlest block, and I will demonstrate to Andrew the concept of in the block. Why I want to do this, I have no idea. Why can't I just enjoy this adorable child? Always this stupid teacher. All right, anyway, big block, little block. I demonstrate. Put the little block into the big block. Andrew is throwing the blocks. Over and over again. Look, Andrew, in, see, put it in, throwing the blocks. That was, I don't know how old he was, probably not quite a year at that point. Now he is, what would you say, is he 18 months? It's summer. He must be about 18 months old, toddler in this picture. All Andrew wants to do is put little things into big things, plus now he's even matching the shapes. All day he is putting little things into big things. We were in the front yard for 3 hours. My back was killing me. He is sticking little sticks. We would pick up the little sticks, sticking them into the grating on the water grate. Here, I'm pointing with my finger. You're not going to be able to see that on the water grate. And 3 hours worth of this. Where'd it go? Why doesn't he get bored with this? Well, he's working right there where he needs to be working. His brain that day was ready, and it wanted, and it was pushing him to figure out what would happen when he put these little things. And do you know, about 3 days later, I tried to get him to put the sticks in the grate, couldn't have been less interested. He had managed whatever it was that his brain told him he needed to do that day, and that was the end of it. Now, that's a preschooler, but the same principle applies, and our job as therapists is to build the readiness and build the skill, but to wait for that golden moment so that when that golden moment comes, you're there, and the materials are there, and the learning is there, and boy, that is a hard job to calibrate that well. Not that we can't move it along some, but there are some things you just can't force, and you have to find ways to build to it. If Andrew had been in an environment where he never saw little things and big things, I doubt if he would have done it at the age that he did it. There's some evidence that they need that preparatory, even though it doesn't seem to be sinking in, it's sort of there in the atmosphere, and when they're ready, they're going to grab onto it. This is Emma, age, I don't know, about whatever, just having learned to walk. You notice how intently she's developing the visual centers in her brain. Now, this is a very early stage of development. She is staring at this, what I think is a cassette here.
Sure it's not a Game Boy?
No, it's not. It's not a Game Boy. Maybe it's a calendar. I don't know what it is. It's something. She is staring. Now, what is her challenge at this age? Her challenge is simply to coordinate the hand. She's got the eye pretty well fixed now on that object. How well is she going to be able to manipulate the connections in that brain to keep this in focus with her eye while she manages to reach out her hand and pick it up? That's an enormous challenge for a brain at this age. And that's what their job is. Now, you see, a lot, I think, of the children that you are working with may not have managed this multi-sensory integration, cross-sensory integration. These are the children who have trouble looking at the chalkboard and writing, or who have trouble listening and writing at the same time, and who can't look and listen. If something is going on visually, they're attending to it, and they can't listen at the same time. This is development that is meant to take place starting very early on as those back areas of the brain are starting to come together. But it takes a long, long time and a lot of practice. And with children like that, we have to be real patient. I've had 7th graders, I had to really explain to their teacher very clearly, this child simply cannot yet. When you're writing on the chalkboard in math class, this child cannot listen to you and copy what you're saying at the same time. Simply cannot do it. Then meanwhile, in therapy, I'm working with this child frantically on learning to do it. But the teachers have to, I think, be helped to understand, and it doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means that something in that connectivity in there is missing. It starts early on. This is Kate and Nathaniel on my kitchen floor. But I mean, this is what childhood looks like. I didn't have any cornmeal. This is flour. Have you ever tried to clean up flour in a grouted floor? Oh my word, I've made the mistake of putting water on it. Oh! This year we used cornmeal. Oh my. Anyway, but look at what's happening here. See, this is what we have to convince parents of. Number one, these are children, by the way, are television free. They've never watched it. No videos, no nothing. Look, they play together. 3 years difference, but they play. I'm bragging about my grandchildren. It's not about me. That's about the fact that their mother had the wit not to show them television. but they play together, they make up games, and look what he's learning about mathematics. I mean, early childhood people and educators, we all know this, but parents do not know that they don't have to use flour on their kitchen floor. But I do have a great story, though, actually, about this. When I was writing Your Child's Growing Mind, I talked to some famous people who had become very well known in their fields. In this case, it was a scientist, a physicist at MIT, who happened to be a personal friend. And he was doing some pretty astonishing things with physics and was head of a department at MIT. And I said, Rick, just tell me this. When you were little, what did your parents do to make you such a great scientist and mathematician? And he said, well, Jane, he said, I don't think my parents did much of anything. He said, in fact, when I was in elementary school, they thought I was mentally retarded. Well, now, Rick is my age, and in those days, the term learning disability did not exist. He said the reason they thought I was mentally retarded was that I couldn't get the equations in order. This is the PhD at MIT. He said, I would have the equals, it reminds me of Lindsay, the equals and the plus, I would have them turned around. And I couldn't put the answer in the right place. And so they decided I was mentally retarded. Well, you know, a lot of very, very talented physicists, surgeons, architects are in your classrooms right now. These are the divergent minds that do not think in the box. They don't think on the lines. They don't necessarily master the written symbols as fast, but they have the big ideas that are going to revolutionize the world. That's why what you're doing is such a sacred mission. You have these terribly important minds right in your classrooms. Anyway, here's Rick. I said, well, what did your mother do? Well, he said, when I used to get home from school, I was pretty downcast in the afternoon because school was hard when I was in elementary school. It was awful. They thought I was stupid. And I'd come in and he said, my mother did one thing that I do remember, and this woman must have been a saint knowing what I know now. He said she had these flour canisters, and she used to let me pour the flour all out over the floor of that's what I was thinking of when I did this, of the kitchen, and I would sit there and I would sift the flour. And I said, oh, hear me with my brand new PhD at that point in Piaget and whatever. You were learning conservation and reversibility and proportion and measuring. Well, actually he was, but he says, no, Jane, I wasn't. He said, I was just sitting and sifting. You know, I thought, what a blessing there was no television blaring in the next room to distract that child from getting in touch with his own mind. And how often do these children, and do we ever give it to them in our classes, a chance to sit and sift? And how often do we sit and sift? Good question to ask. A lot of what we bring to the therapy situation is about where we are ourselves, you know this, personally, emotionally, on that particular day. Anyway, but look what is being learned here. In language, cooperation, quantity, I don't need to tell you all that. But the parents don't know this. They don't know that hands-on play is much better for their children than computers. You can't model this stuff on a computer. Studies have been done in which they tried, starting with the clear understanding from the research that the best preparation for children's mathematics learning in school and the best predictor of early math achievement is whether their parents played board games with them and card games. Tell your parents that. They're learning numerals, they're learning quantity, they're learning counting forward and backward. They're learning, here's your ADD kid, learning to put a little counter in one space and then another space and then managing his behavior to put it yet in another space, and he can't play or win the game unless he can do that. I mean, that's frontal lobe training. It's training those circuits. So, all right, they have tried to make computer programs that would do the same thing. Why not? A lot of parents don't want to take the time to play board games with their children. So in the one study that I'm thinking of, Robbie Case did this, and they worked and worked and worked on these computer programs. Wow, we have got it now. Parents are off the hook. We'll put the kid on the computer. So they compared the two conditions, child on the computer, child playing with the parent. Oh darn, he still did better with the parent. So back to the drawing board, what was the critical variable that made the difference? They isolated the variables. What do you think it was? The interaction. Of course there's an emotional thing there. You can't measure language, because the parent was working in the child's zone of proximal development. The parent was scaffolding the child's cognitive development by the language they used. Had never had these terms in a course. They didn't know what they were doing. But if the child didn't understand how to use a ladder and chutes and ladders, the parent was saying, we go up, we go down, you go down the chute and up the ladder. They were scaffolding. They were using that zone of proximal development. And so the computer program never did the job. And so tell your parents, get on the floor and play games with your kids, and their math achievement will go up. I bet their attention will too. See, we also have accountability here. Poor Kate, she was trying. I finished the job. But that's something that's missing with computer play. Children do not have to be accountable. A 7th grade girl told me, I love SimCity. SimCity is the one where you create the civilization. It can be useful if it's used in a part of a social studies program with a good teacher standing by and making sure it's used properly and that the kids are actually learning something. She says, I'm playing on my own. She says, it's marvelous. I'll tell you what I learned. She said, I learned it doesn't matter what kind of a government or an economy you put in. Because if you don't like it, it doesn't work, you just blow it all up and start all over again. And I'm thinking, oh, swell, let's hope this girl doesn't get elected president in about another 30 years. Oh! So, but with regular hands-on learning, and again with your parents, do those children have chores? Do they have pets that they have to take care of? Pets are a very civilizing influence. I had a 5th grade teacher who told me I've started bringing small animals into my room because these children are so vicious to each other. The only time they get nice is when they're taking care of the animals. Isn't that interesting? Well, all right. So, we need to build in that accountability. And when I'm working with a child therapeutically, by the way, as far as accountability, and I doubtless you do this too, we don't say, what was your mistake there? I say, what did you do that made it come out that way? What did you do? Child comes to me, says, my teacher, I failed the test on Friday. I failed the test. And the next words out of this kid's mouth, because he has an external locus of control, are going to be, the room was too hot. Who could possibly learn from this teacher? The questions were too hard. The paper wasn't the right dimension. My pencil, they don't make good pencils. Whatever. It wasn't his fault. I simply say to him, what could you have done to make that come out better for you? And I sit there and I look at him until he answers. And sometimes it's, maybe study. But it's always, what did you do, or what are you going to do? Not what are you going to expect someone else to do. Not what are you going to wait for the teacher to do. Not what are you going to wait for a miracle to happen. The children you're working with are magical thinkers. The miracle will happen next week. And I'll have brand new shiny shoes, and I'm suddenly going to ace the math test even if I don't study. That'll be the miracle. Well, it doesn't happen, unfortunately. So always that accountability issue. And that's what those ADD kids constantly need, to be held to, all right, what can you do to help this? And maybe it's just one tiny little thing, but anyway. Okay, so what do we have here? Your job, interesting challenges. Nature is cooperating with us if we're only waiting to listen, plus support. And they need time. Oh, does it take time? I hope you can get more and more time with these kids because you're giving them what they need. And then you get a turned on learning brain, not just one that's turned off, waiting for the next external stimulation. Hey, this is childhood. Look at the tactile going on there. Big tactile, you know, is a big important part of learning. Look at what might be viewed as play, but look at the learning that's going on here in this block corner. I'm very big on blocks. This is a very, very expensive private school in New York City. Very expensive, very hard to get into. There's Nathaniel learning about sound. The difference is he's making it himself. He's not being barraged by electronic sounds. And the quality of so much of what children get today is the level of taste in children's video and computer programs is just ghastly. The sound is garish and blaring. The colors are ugly. The pictures move too fast. Anyway, all right, enough about all that. Oh, there's our stupid little thing. All right, this is childhood. Here's a child, this is not mine, this is from a UNESCO calendar. This child he's learning to be a child, a human being in the world, in nature, in himself. And now I want to just conclude with some thoughts about the brain development. And here I'm putting the heavy stuff at the end, which is not good practice, but you guys are up for this. In terms of the development, this is basically what you've been seeing. Here's your cerebellum back here. And that is the great unexplored wasteland that we still have so much to learn about. Watch for, if you're interested in the research, watch for research on this. I think you're going to see more. It also seems to have a great deal to do with your sexual life as well, which is also very interesting. But I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to say any more about that. The gatekeeper, as I've called him down here, is what Paul MacLean called the reptilian brain. It's also actually technically part of the reticular formation, the reticular activating system. And in another picture, you'll see it has the power to send messages all the way up to the front of the brain here. This is the part of the brain that it is thought, in connection with some things you can't see here, which are underneath the cortex, has the power to turn off or turn on the cortex for academic kinds of learning. So then we have the occipital lobe here. That's the visual part. Remember when the people saw the flash of light, this is where the normal brains lit up. And so did the deaf brains, but the deaf brains also lit up in part of the temporal lobe, which is where you hear. And that angular gyrus that I was referring to, which links, particularly in the left hemisphere, links sound and symbol so that children can start to make sense of reading, is located in the junction of these three sensory lobes, the occipital vision, the temporal for mostly auditory, but a lot of other stuff too, and the parietal lobe, which has to do with your awareness of three-dimensional space, your visual spatial skills, as opposed to just your balance down here. But this is your thinking about visual spatial skills. This is all the cortical part. So that part that seems to be so integral in readings is almost like it's linking these three areas, big areas. So when we saw Emma, the underneath 1-year-old, staring at that object and trying to get her motor cortex organized to reach out for it, what she's basically doing is building networks and networks and networks and networks of connections that pull all these sensory systems together. And that is really the job of early childhood. And that is why it is so frightening to me to put them on a computer. It is such a reductive environment. And television is such a reductive environment, although with television, at least they are often playing. There have been studies that show that most children, when they have the tube on, also are rolling a ball or horsing around with their brother or sister or playing with a doll or maybe, coloring or something. And they look up when the television attracts their attention with a loud noise or a bright flash of color, which are the features that the advertisers and the children's programmers use to get the brain looking, to alert the brain whether it wants to be alerted or not. So with the computer, man, they are there, and it's a very reductive environment because they're not doing anything else. The motor cortex is developing very early. The brain basically myelinates from bottom back over top front, with the exception of the motor cortex, which starts to myelinate early on so that it can start to coordinate vision, like looking and grabbing something, and eventually put it together with this. But you really some of your children may be ones that are very badly in need of recess, which is being dumped out of a lot of schools now. They may be the ones who need it the most, and they may actually, their bodies may still need that. And again, get those parents to take them off that television. Man, oh man. All right, now, I'll save this part for last. This is the whole frontal lobe up here. It comprises the motor cortex and the prefrontal cortex. This is the part I've been referring to as the executive system. The part that enables you to plan ahead, to think about things that aren't there. The back of the brain is like a storehouse of sensory information and information. The front of the brain is what enables us to imagine, to think beyond what is literally there, and to plan ahead, to see ourselves as a moral, social human being. The spurt of development that brings these areas along individually and learning to work together happens mostly before and during elementary school. If you're working with third graders, your kids they start to be very literal at that age, don't they? Because this storehouse is filling up very nicely, and they're getting very competent, and they're learning to copy neatly. Most of them are. Maybe the ones you're working with aren't, but many 8- and 9-year-olds, they're really on top of their form. They've mastered that concrete world, and they've got a hold of it, and they're full of information, and they can't wait to learn more information, and they can't wait to tell you everything they know, and they can't wait their brains are just sucking up stuff, and yet they're still quite literal. And then age 9 or so starts to come along, 4th grade, and all of a sudden, this part of the brain, which has been myelinating slowly all along, gets a spurt. And in girls, it can be as young as 8 when it starts, some boys perhaps. For most kids, the real spurt in this prefrontal cortex appears to come somewhere in the teen years, and for many people, our brains are not fully myelinated up here until we're maybe 30. Now, even beyond 30, you can still go on building new dendrites your whole life. But as far as your basic stages of development, as far as we know now, the last myelination really occurs in the teenage and 20 years of this part and the corpus callosum that joins the two hemispheres. That seems to be the latest thinking. It was thought that it was all over by age 18 until not long ago. But now they're saying that if you're between 20 and 30, anybody here still between 20 and 30? If you have kids or friends who are, mention to them that if they make any major life decisions, they may literally have changed their minds by the time they hit 30. Um, so, which could account for the poor success rate of many early marriages. I guess we just lucked out. But anyhow, this is a late period of development, and the good news about this is that when your students get there, they will have new ammunition to bring to the learning process. So if they haven't learned it, it's like the girl I tried to teach the adjectives and adverbs to, not very successfully apparently. But she had new equipment in her brain with which to learn that she hadn't had when she was in the 3rd grade. That's why I could say to her with absolute assurance, don't worry about it. You got new stuff up here now. Let's learn it with those circuits and forget the ones that got messed up earlier on. And you will notice that very often, and there's sort of with ADD kids, there's sort of an old truism that says when they get to be 13, a lot of them spontaneously seem to get over it. And that is actually not true, but many of them do get better. And the reason is that they start to build connections up here that can get control of the base impulses from the lower areas. And let's move to that now before we finish. This is what I wanted to complete here. Here we have, now we're looking underneath the cortex as we look at the limbic system, this emotional system. Think of this as nestled, like this cat, nestled down in under all this thinking equipment that you have in there. If you've heard of the hypothalamus, the amygdala, there are a lot of areas down there, the hippocampus, connected with memory, emotional memory and other kinds of memory are all down in here, very much connected with emotion and very powerful as far as throwing chemicals out into the brain that can either make it connect or not connect. If you're in a state of terror, you're probably not using your prefrontal cortex a whole lot. You're down here somewhere fighting, fleeing, or whatever. It's like, do I fight it or eat it or mate with it? You know, that's the basic questions that these parts of your brains are asking down here. This part up here is like, wait a minute, let's plan tonight's dinner menu. But if you're out in the woods hiking and you know there are bears around, as I often am in the Rocky Mountains, and I'm planning the dinner menu or thinking about Robert Frost or Schopenhauer or whatever, and I hear a roar, or I see a flash of brown off to my peripheral visual field, trust me, Schopenhauer falls right out of my brain and I'm back down here. And I'm not going to take the last alternative with that bear, and I'm not going to eat it, so I would like to flee as fast as possible. And then your cortex gets engaged to say precisely how am I going to flee? Facing him or with my back to him? But this is what the TV producers capitalize on, is this response down here. Because they know that if they do a loud noise, you're going to alert. You can't help it. If they go like this to you, you're going to alert because that's a danger signal. And if there's a color moving out here, you're going to alert because that's a danger signal to the brain in the natural state. They use those features, and you watch children's television and also video games, of course, and that is what you will see. And that is what they mean when they say they keep the child's brain alerted whether it wants to be or not. Now, we wonder why they can't then manage their own systems of alerting, which is your attention system. Hello, why can't they manage their own attention systems? It's because they've been managed for them externally since the day they were born. And that's what we've got. Then you get the maturation starting up here, and the language says to these guys, settle down, let me think this through. And you have to almost have them verbalize it and get in the habit of it. But let's calm down, let's stop responding, at an animalistic level here, and let's put our human brain in charge and let us manage our motion and our behavior. Don't forget that the motor cortex is tied right in with this prefrontal cortex here. So managing your behavior physically and managing your behavior mentally and cognitively are right next door to each other. So I like to link them when I'm doing therapy because I think they may prove to be linked at some point. So anyway, where is the self in all this? I think it's here very much in our ability to be a part of a thinking culture, as a thinking human being relating to other human beings, as a person who is able to enjoy being inside one's own head instead of having constantly to have input coming in at you. I think that's where the self is, and I don't suspect they're going to locate the soul in the brain, but if they ever do, it's going to be connected to that somehow. At least it's wherever it is, it's connected to that somehow. And this is all very heavily dependent upon your emotional tone. So the last message I really want to leave you with is you have the opportunity to let children, be themselves, to recognize their potential, to awaken them to the fact that life and learning are not just about phonics and linguistic awareness and all the things that we know to be so terribly important, but that by your very presence and your very attitudes in their lives, you can open them up to themselves, their own souls, their own being, and their own love of being a human being and of other people. So I thank you very much, and I really applaud your mission